Hey everybody, OCD Mikey, HiFi guy here, and I am making a video in response to my last video where a lot of people said, can you kind of explain to us the difference between the classes of amplifiers? Okay, now for my purpose of describing this, I am going to keep it extremely simple. I'm not going to go into the differences from a circuit standpoint of what a Class A and a Class AB does. I'm going to give you the important things that you really need to know because all the other stuff is just kind of trivial. It's just for interest. The amplifiers start with Class A. That's the oldest design. Then they go forward. The Class B, then Class AB, then Class C, then Class D. Those are all the newest. As the new technology is adopted, they adopt a new letter right down the alphabet. So that's the first thing to know is that Class A is the oldest, and then B is the next newest, then C, then D, and so forth. Now I think Class H, which I'm not even interested in knowing about. But the main ones that you even need to be concerned about are Class A, Class AB, and Class D, okay? And you may say, well, why do I care about the differences? Okay, why would you even... Class A is the most archaic old technology, okay? That is extremely inefficient, okay? As we move forward in the lineage of amplifiers, the main thing is they get more efficient. They, out of the process that happens, more of the energy that is created goes into sound coming out of your speaker than goes into heat. Because the byproduct, the wasted product of an amplifier is heat when it makes the sound louder. So as the amps get newer, they get more efficient. Class A typically has a very liquid mid-range sound. It's very thick through the body. It has a real sort of a texture to it, okay? The other byproduct, or the other actual characteristic, rather, of the Class A amplifier is it has incredible current capability. These are the amps that you hear people talking about. You can arc weld with them. You can put wires on the end of the speaker cables. If you touch those two wires together, they're going to weld themselves together. You'll get a big spark and they will melt. The wires will melt together and weld themselves together. You could use those and put a probe on it, and I'm sure you could arc weld with an amplifier. We used to do, the amp company that I bought back in the 90s, or in the early 2000s rather, they used to run a blender at the show. They would take, and it was called AB International, was the name of the company that I owned. They would take that amplifier and hook up a blender to it. So the amplifier would power a blender, and they made margaritas for the people at the show. Okay, so this is the 80s, back in the heyday. They used to actually blend margaritas using the amplifier as the power supply. Those were the kind of fun things that they did back in the day of the heyday of HiFi. Another couple notes of interest, Frank Zappa used to use the AB International amps. I have a killer picture of Frank Zappa holding a tour jacket that says AB International on the back, or AB Systems, because it was AB Systems back then. AB Systems came from Alltech Lansing, from some guys in Alltech Lansing, Bob Bird and George Anderson. So it was Anderson and Bird, A and B, AB Systems. And I bought that company. Bob Bird and George Anderson worked alongside Nelson Pass. And so it was a great lineage. That company was kind of like a crown or a crest, but they never quite took off and went the big like Crown and Crest did. AB still remained a U.S.-made, hand-built amplifier. They're in a lot of installs. They're in the George Lucas's viewing the whole screening room on the Presidio in San Francisco. I sold, I think, a dozen amplifiers under the JSX rebrand, but that was very much made by us. And so interesting kind of lineage. That's just a little side note about AB International. But we made Class AB amps, okay? The AB amp is not like, so if you imagine a Class A is, let's say, 25% efficient, Class AB is like 50% efficient, okay? And what that does, Class A is always pedal to the metal. That means when you switch on a Class A amp, it is at full power immediately. It's full tilt boogie. And the Class AB uses a couple stages in there that allows it to not work at full tilt all the time. You have a structure where as you turn it up, it goes to full tilt. But when it sits idle, it sits idle. It's not maxed out. The Class A, when it never sits idle. When it's just sitting there and you're not using it, it is at full tilt power. That's why they're so hot, because it's the same as cranking an amp all the time. So Class A will drain your energy and it's going to heat the room. Why is it good? Has a lot of current, okay? It has a lot of current, and for nostalgia's sake, Class A is kind of cool. But anybody currently making a Class A amplifier, it's kind of silly, okay? It's sort of catering to the people that think, oh, we still have to have Class A. In this day and age, I don't think it's necessary to have Class A. And in my opinion, a Class AB that's done well totally kicks ass on a Class A. That's all there is to it. But there's very few people that know how to do Class AB well, because people stopped advancing them back in the 90s when Class AB petered out or topped out, and when it was, as good as it could get, they thought. People stopped moving it forward. So a lot of the Class AB amps that you see now are still the same stuff from back then, with just they change the component parts. Like as one part becomes obsolete, they spec in the new part that replaces it, and they change the circuit just to fit that new part. And so that's all they've done over the last 20 years with these things, or 30 years, is just keep replacing the parts that go obsolete to keep that same amplifier architecture running, okay? And they were good back then, they're good now. So, but they're still, it's what I talked about in the last video, they're old technology. Jeff Rowland, as you could see in the example, is the latest technology with Class AB. It doesn't even have a transformer in it. Jeff Rowland, in my opinion, has taken Class AB design farther than anybody has, okay? He's still advancing it. And actually, I think with the 625S2, in his words, to me, he said, I've taken Class AB as far as it can go. So it's pretty interesting. So Class AB is going to be your typical HiFi amplifier. It's still old technology, but Class AB has still has a little more distortion, and it's less efficient than the Class D, okay? Class D is even less distortion. It's even cleaner, okay? Now, some people, it bothers them with the Class D, because if Class D is not done well, it can be threadbare and strident. It can be too clean, and it's that problem that we get where something gets too analytical and too clean. Then it can be revealing at that point. Then it reveals the shortcomings in your rig. And what's funny is people a lot of times will blame the new amp, but the amp is just revealing the shortcomings of the rest of the rig. The amp isn't necessarily doing anything wrong, but people say, oh, I don't like the sound of that amp. Well, really, you don't like the sound of the rest of your rig, because that amp is just simply revealing it to you, okay? The other amp is covering it up with harmonic distortion, so you're not hearing the inadequacies of the rest of your rig. Your sharp DAC, for instance. You put a sharp DAC with the Class A, it's going to soften that sharp DAC, because the Class A or the Class AB is going to have more harmonic distortion. So it's going to offset that that harshness of a harsh DAC. Whereas on the other hand, you put, say, a DAC that's a little strident with a Class D amp, it's going to be even more strident, because there's even less distortion. There isn't that fuzz in the mid-range that an A or an AB has. It's going to be real clean through the mid-range, so it can be a little bit more sharp. Class D, you really have to have your rig put together. You must have a world-class amplifier, a world-class DAC, a real good preamp, then you put a Class D with it, and there's nothing more clean, there's nothing more fast. What Class D has that the other guys don't have is they're extremely fast transient response. And the GaN, okay, which is the new type of Class D, it's called gallium nitride, you may have heard. That is a new material for making chips. Instead of silicon, they use gallium nitride to make the chips. Gallium nitride is a design that allows for even faster switching. So that means in your switching part, your PWM part of that amplifier, you can switch super fast, which gives you very fast transient response. It gives you a much smoother sine wave that you're trying to, because it's a step function. You can imagine it's like this, right, to make the sine wave. If you make those littler or smaller little increments, you can make a smoother sine wave, closer to an actual analog sine wave. Okay, that is with the Class D. So why you might want Class D is their size, they're smaller, they're lighter, they're way more efficient, so they don't burn the energy the other amps do. They're less heat, and they are faster. They are amazingly quick, especially with a GAN amp. Especially with a GAN amp like AGD. Why is it in a tube? Okay, so it's put into a vacuum tube as a way to keep the amplifier away from the power supply and do it in a very elegant way. Okay, so as you saw in the Jeff Rowland amp, the amplifier's up here, then the power supply is on the bottom, and there's a wall in between to prevent them from being close. You really don't want, if you can prevent it, you don't want your power supply. You saw in the Krell that toroid was encapsulated in steel and potted to keep the radiation from coming off there and messing with the amplifier channels. So another way to do that is you separate the power supply. Get that radiation away from the amplifier channels. So in the Rowland, he puts it in two different compartments of a milled block of billet aluminum. Okay, that's a very a technologically advanced way of separating them out, and it's like going to the nines. You're actually you're sparing no cost, and you're doing it in the absolute most efficient manner you could do to put it into one box. The other way is to put it in two boxes. Sometimes you'll see an amplifier and a power supply split into two boxes, or a preamp especially, because that circuitry is even more delicate, and you'll see that separated with a power supply. That's to get the radiation away from the delicate circuits. Okay, so in the AGD, he puts it up in a tube. So it's outside of the chassis of the power supply. The power supply is down in the chassis. The amplifier is up in the tube. And it is an absolutely, totally cool way to do it. What a cool, elegant way to do it.